Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Karen,
And I'm Andy McNeil.
and we are thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating a community after somebody has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever need to grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people in this field so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. We are pleased to welcome Susan Ma to our show. Susan has a master's degree in clinical social work and a master's in fine art photography. In addition to working full-time as a psychotherapist in Northern California, Susan is the creator of The Lost Project. The Lost Project is a merging of psychology and photography, an artistic exploration of the human condition presented in a series of environmental portraits with the theme of loss. It found its proper home at Heal Grief, where Susan's Lost Project portrays portraits related to death, along with the subjects' stories of their grief, are exhibited in a worldwide online gallery. The Lost Project becomes a form of art therapy, free of charge, where anyone in the world can share their grief experience, let others know they are not alone in their healing.
So welcome, Susan. We are so glad to have you with us today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So one program that I really love on the Heal Grief website, as Andy was talking about, is the Lost Project. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit more about your passion behind this project.
Well, I think we live in a society that is very dismissive of grief. A lot of times I find that in my work with patients, people are allowed a couple weeks or so to be sad about a loss. And then it's almost like their friends and their family and people in their support network are eager for them to move on. You know, the folks get a lot of feedback like, it's time to let it go. You know, it's time to move on. You need to accept it. And people really seem to be denied that time to heal. And there seems to also be a lack of understanding of how long that healing might take place. Some people do feel okay in a couple weeks. Some people are still struggling 2 months later, 2 years later, 20 years later. And so what I like so much about Heal Grief is that it's created on the premise that there is no timeline and that grief is a very individual process.
So what was the inspiration behind the Lost Project? Like, how did you, obviously you're a photographer, and so that it's not unreasonable what you came up with, but how did you first conceptualize this, and really what was your inspiration behind creating the Lost Project?
Well, I've been a psychotherapist I was a psychotherapist for 13 years before I took a break and went back to school to get my master's in fine art. And while I was in school, I found that I really kind of missed my profession and missed, I guess, exploring just kind of the human condition. And so when I had to do my thesis project for my master's degree in fine art, I wanted to somehow bring together my interest in psychology and my love of social work with photography. So I brought those two worlds together. And so initially I thought of it as just more of a merging of my interests career-wise. But then as I worked on the project over a 2-year period, I realized it was really more about me. You know, my father died when I was 30 years old, which was a very devastating loss. I had lost a 7-year relationship with somebody that I was in a relationship with. I had some, like, my babies, my dogs died. And so I had just had a lot of loss of my own. And I think that I, without even realizing it, was trying to work through my own losses while simultaneously trying to help people through theirs. So it was about my efforts to provide some sort of art therapy for those involved with the project, but I think it was also a way to try to heal myself.
Yeah, to use that that love you have for photography as a way of doing that. That's great. Yeah.
And something that I love when you look at pictures on the Lost Project is that they're not necessarily like the picture of the person who died, right? But they are moments of grief that kind of like nobody talks about. But one that really stuck out to me when I saw it one time was earring in the carpet. I remember, Susan, you showed me that when I first met you. And I thought, what an interesting thing that could just be so overlooked, but could really be a trigger or be really impactful for someone, that they now have a way to express that moment. And I just feel like that's a really cool outlet that you don't see a lot of the times. So I'm wondering, are there other kind of, either from your own photography or photography that people have submitted, are there other ones that really just kind of like hit you in a certain way as being really impactful?
I mean, the series of portraits that I did originally are the grievers, people who are experiencing the loss. But then when I partnered with Heal Grief and we opened up the Lost Project to the public, that's when we invited people to share images, not of the person who died, like a memorial, but either somewhere or something that triggers the memory of that person. One that really stands out for me is a woman whose mother died, and she really loved pickles. And after her mother died, she was going to clean out her mother's refrigerator, but she just didn't want to throw away those pickles. So she just kind of left them there. And year after year, they just kind of sit there as homage, to her mom.
Right.
And so she submitted for the Lost Project this picture of the inside of her refrigerator. And I just thought, that was very creative, and what a great daily reminder. I mean, you open up the refrigerator every day, and then here you are with this nice memory, and so I thought that was really kind of sweet and lovely that she just wanted to hold on to that. But, this is an example of something that some people might find silly or like, why are you doing that? But it's a good example of, we all just deal with it in our own way. And if this provides you comfort and if this provides you solace, then do it. It's not hurting anyone.
Yeah. Well, and it also, to me, just the idea of a jar of pickles in a refrigerator. I mean, how much more just sort of ordinary daily sort of, experience do you get? And isn't that a reflection of grief? Grief is not this behemoth, right? It's a daily experience in our lives. We live with it. And when you walk down the street, you don't know that every 2 or 3 or 4 people you pass, you don't know what they're carrying in their heart, because they're not showing you that. Grief is I like to say, it's a practical experience. It's not just this thing happening in our head. It's life, and it somehow connects us to the past, and also in some ways propels us into the people that we become. So isn't that interesting? Just a jar of pickles in a refrigerator, and how ordinary that is. But isn't that grief? Because it's lived in our ordinary lives.
I really like the quote that says, grief is love with nowhere to go, and I find that to really be true. And in my work with patients as a therapist, I'm amazed at how many people, young and old, are struggling with grief. It's a huge problem for so many of the people I work with. And it's something that most therapists don't even delve into. And so I've really enjoyed introducing the Lost Project to my patients and letting them share their images, write their own stories. And you'll just be amazed at people who, once they, I help them write the story and they put their image on the site and then they see it, it's like almost like they breathe a sigh of relief, like, wow, like I've kind of been able to put my grief somewhere
Yeah.
and let it rest. And a lot of people don't want to go to therapy. A lot of people don't want to talk about their losses. And so being able to participate in this project in a very private way, you don't have to leave your house. You can just stay at home and submit your image, write your story. It can be very healing for people who just want to deal with grief privately, don't want to make it public, don't want to go to a therapist, don't want to do any kind of formal intervention.
Yeah.
And also the fact of like maybe seeing somebody else's photo and going, oh my gosh, I do something different, but I'm realizing that that's not weird. So for somebody it might be pickles, for somebody else it might be shirts in a closet. And oh my gosh, it's not wrong for me to have these shirts or have this reminder. I think that's kind of like this beautiful silent, like, hey, you're not alone in this. And that creates a community, even though you may not be talking to these people. It's normalizing it in a way that like, it's okay. We do things like this in our grief. And I think that's a really special aspect to this too.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I mean, as a matter of fact, someone did look at the picture of the pickles, and then they also submitted a very similar image of some groceries that their mom had, and they didn't want to throw away. And, it was just like, oh, I'm not crazy for keeping this stuff, And, I think people judge themselves very harshly in their grief of like, oh, well, I shouldn't be doing this or I shouldn't be thinking this. It's like, you can do whatever you want, as long as you're not hurting anyone or not hurting yourself, there's no rules. And so I like the fact that the Lost Project can allow for different types of feelings. And sometimes it's not always sadness. Sometimes, people have a very complicated relationship with the person who died, and it can have stir up very negative feelings, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. And we want people to know it's okay. Maybe your loved one died and you're grief stricken in a heartfelt way. Maybe you're just super angry and kind of glad they're gone. It's okay to have all these different feelings, and we want people to accept that within themselves, because having a lot of shame about your grief or beating yourself up about it, that's not helping anyone.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Susan, we only have a few minutes left, and I'm wondering if there's someone listening who says, I'd like to find out more about the Lost Project. I'd like to connect with Susan. How can they do that?
Well, they would just go to the healgrief.org website, and then at the top of the page there's it says programs, and then you would click on programs, go down to where it says the Lost Project, and there you can see the photos that I created. And then below the photos that I created, which are black and white, there's another link that says art by others, and then they would click on that. And that's
Okay.
how a person can submit a photo and a story to the Lost Project. And all those photos and all those stories go directly to my email. So that would also be a way to communicate with me.
Okay.
And then on the Lost Project section of the Heal Grief website, there's also a link to my photography website, Susan Ma Photography, and people could also email me there. And I welcome any questions, concerns, any sort of queries that people have.
Well, and we hope that the folks who are listening, we hope that you will take advantage of that and reach out to Susan and make a connection here. Particularly if you're even asking the question, if you're saying, I don't know if this is something that I would be good at or I could do, still reach out. It's worth trying. And just sometimes it takes that little bit of just courage to do that. So encourage you to do that.
Yeah, and I would encourage people, you don't have to be an artist. You don't have to be super creative. It's a very simple idea. And you don't have to have any special skills. So it's really literally open to everyone.
Great.
Wonderful. Susan, we just want to thank you once again for being our guest here at Let's Talk Death, and really for creating such an amazing and creative grief outlet for everybody and for healgrief.org. We're so grateful. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled about the opportunity to talk and appreciate your interest.
Great. So for those who are listening in, if you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, you can visit healgrief.org. You can also learn about some other Heal Grief programs there, including Actively Moving Forward, which is support for young adults, again, by visiting healgrief.org.
Let's Talk Death episodes will air monthly, so make sure you sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for a link to next month's episode.
So with that, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.